Rusty, you got a thought?
No, I'm seeing that.
All right, so here we go. So, you know, I'm not getting enough detail out of this size. I'd call this a thumbnail. This is still an exploratory sketch, but it's not really thumbnail sized anymore. And so I like this size, maybe a little bit smaller. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna play with the proportions just a little bit. And as I said, you know, what I'm most concerned with in starting this drawing is setting it up. And so I'm gonna go with a very shallow angle coming back this way and a steeper angle coming back that way. And that should allow this handle to come through, which means that my convergence, there won't be too much convergence going back there. Like I said, I wanted to play with the proportions as opposed to like starting with a square, like a cube. This feels a little short to me, which makes sense for a carafe. You really want to spread out that bottom surface on the heating element so that the whole thing stays hot. However, I'm just interested to see what would happen with this form. Maybe this will turn into a tea kettle as opposed to a coffee maker, and carafe for a coffee maker. So I'm coming in with that proportion. There's my proportion. Here's my convergence coming back a lot quicker, right? So look at just the rate of convergence, slower this way, coming back that way. We're still seeing a little bit of a challenge in just getting that convergence down. So there's my overall shape. I will see through this. So now what I want to do is determine where is that break for the handle. And I'm gonna kind of use the rule of thirds a little bit, somewhere close to the rule of thirds. Up at the top, one of the things that again, this is what I'm learning as I go through this process, is where does the lid start and where does it stop? And I haven't really been overly happy with all that. And how does that integrate in with the hinge? So I'm gonna try and figure that out a little bit earlier on this sketch than I did a minute ago. Well, let me play with the proportions. So one thing that I can do, this is the other just kind of lesson that comes from this, to get this 45-degree angle, what's a good way that I can kind of get this angle coming from here where that cut is? Just guess at it. What do you think? I could draw this. If I got that proportion right, then that should give me, it should converge, but that should give me a pretty good idea as to what that angle is. And I can even carry that over. Well, we're not going to do that, but I can do the same thing down here. And I'm going to use that same rule of thirds. Establish this cool kind of triangular spout. And then from here, I'm gonna come down at an angle. I may be losing my proportions again already. I want to exaggerate that. Intentionality, right? Let's bring this up at an angle. Here's that. So here's this little triangle shape that comes out. I could carry this over to the other side and that up. So I've got my basic shape down. Oops, I missed this. So I've got these just weird, but I think very interesting things happening. So here's the break in the material. Let me give some thickness to this little piece of plastic. Somewhere in here I have to have a hinge. I'll figure that out in a second. And then my plastic is going to stop at some point. I'm going to let that wrap over the top surface. And I just think, you know, this goes back to when I did my first internship, one of the guys I was working with said, everything you draw looks like Darth Vader. And I just had this style back then, and I guess I still have it. This one's got that Darth Vader kind of
Dark side.
faceted feel. Yeah, I just like it. My favorite Star Wars movie is Rogue One.
Yeah.
The end of Rogue One.
I like it.
End of Rogue One. Okay, so here I've got a decision to make. I need somewhere for this to hinge down. My hinge is gonna be. Oh, it's just so weird because that hinge really needs the axis for that hinge needs to be right there. I'm gonna work it in something like that. And then I'm gonna bring this down at an angle. To give me enough room. And then that's where my handle ultimately will be. Here's the 5 lines. You know, we're thinking about, we talk about 5 lines in studio and when that comes into play. This is thinking about these proportions and where, you know, should I go to the rule of thirds here? What about the proportion of the here's glass, this is gonna be plastic. I don't want that to come directly into the plastic. I want some material thickness. What can I do right there? And then what about the distance from here to here? It's thinking about, you know, it's driven not only by aesthetics, but also by comfort. Let's see there. I'll see a little bit of daylight. And then that would come, let's see, that would come up like this. So I've got my basic shape down. Now I need to maybe add some fillets. And I think the way that Rusty and I approach fillets are basically the same in that we draw the long gestured lines first, and then we come back in and add those fillets after the fact. And we're not just starting over here and drawing a line and then carrying that line over and then carrying that line back this way. We are, we're working long, fillet. And this is about the time where, even though I don't really like to use tools, this is about the time where maybe a tool comes in handy. One thing that's interesting about this little fillet right here that I can help communicate what's happening is that there's a step. There's like a step on that fillet that would run up like this. And so that fillet would come down like that. And that helps define, here it's difficult to see, it helps define that fillet kind of works like a contour line that helps define that this steps up right there and over. All right. Should I just render this one?
You give me a first idea. I got my own stuff going on over here.
I'm going to render this one. I was going to render one of my copies. And we'll get some bleeding. Oh, the other thing I need is, and this will be cool for this one. Oh yeah, this is going to be awesome. So I need this top surface to be concave, right? It's acting like a funnel. And so I'm gonna try and create basically this same shape down here, but I'm gonna offset it, right? So I want to offset, I'm thinking about this shape, and I'm thinking about it being really small, and not directly in the middle of this surface, but in the middle of this surface and down. And so I'm just gonna kind of think about that as the center, and I'm just gonna take and offset these lines to make a small opening. I'm looking at this angle, I'm gonna pull it in right here to make a small opening. Oh yeah, this is neat. This is more Darth Vader than any of mine that I've done so far. And so I can also kind of connect and show kind of, I guess this would need to be flat right here. And then there'd be some material thickness in there. There's a fillet running around. And show how that's recessed. But I don't even have to really put these, wow, I can actually see it better looking up like that. That's cool. I don't actually have to put these lines that I'm putting on here to see that is recessed or that is below this surface, simply because of kind of one of the things that we talked about. Do I have another example of that? This summer, which was when you put kind of a chamfered, this makes it almost like a really large chamfered surface, just to draw the same thing smaller and move it that way and up a little bit, and it shows that it's a recessed surface. So I'm kind of using that same principle here. All right, there is one last thing, Rusty, that I need. Does anybody have a triangle with them that I can ink with? That's fine. All right, so let's talk about glass for a second. And I'll show you, there is a video on Canvas from last year, which I think is better than either of these two examples. But one of the things, and then I've put a link to a couple, but this stuff, to me, the best way to do something like this, I'm winging it. I'm looking at images of carafes and glasses on Google or Pinterest, and I just look at what's happening to the edges. And what typically happens to the edges is that it gets a little bit of gray, kind of where there's a lot of edges coming together. And then the way that I like to think of it, and the way that I've kind of moved on, is I like to do two lines and then fill in those lines. And those two lines represent the thickness of that glass. And then fill in those lines in certain places and put little dots in there. But I think that this to me reads pretty well as glass. And then sometimes you're thinking about, okay, well, if that's a weird surface, is it reflecting down, and maybe would it get a little bit more dark in there? You can see that these are far from being mirror images of one another in the way that glass is approached. But then the thing that helps define it as glass is just, you'll see the back side a little bit. You could think about some of the refraction. I have no idea if that's the way that would actually refract for a surface that's moving back like so. And in fact, I did it down there and then I did it up here. So I'm not even necessarily that consistent. It's just there are a couple of things that I'll try and show you with glass rendering. And the other thing I want to point out here is, again, we don't need you to fully render out everything and fill every surface of your product with marker. Okay. In fact, like here, I just chose most of the top surfaces. I'm just leaving white. And I also often will leave like a fillet like this, just white. So this is what I found worked the second time through. I'm going to take my Papermate Flare and I'm going to think about this material thickness. I don't have it drawn in before I've even taken this flare out. But I'm going to draw a double line, and I'm putting a lot of pressure on this. I want it to be fairly thick. I'm going to draw a double line in there. I'm going to try and be as consistent as I possibly can be with that double line, which is defining, again, the thickness of the glass. I'm thinking I won't see much of this fillet back there, but notice that I've left just the tiniest little space in there and didn't fully connect it. I probably could have done something like we did on the die this summer, right here, where maybe these come in together, but I'll probably fill that in with black in just a minute. And then, you know, again, this is me winging it. I don't think I'm gonna see as much of this back surface. And so, whereas I was putting a lot of pressure just a moment ago, I'm putting a little bit less pressure. Like the light diffusion.
I noticed as Jared's doing this, he's talking about how much pressure he's putting on the flare. I noticed on a number of the drawings that were turned in today, a lot of the line weight all around the drawing is really consistent. You know, we call it 3+ line weight, but even with Jared putting slightly different pressure behind glass, what's in front of the front part of the glass, what might be behind liquid, you know, there's lots of different, you know, line weights, and it's important that you show at least a few, you know, 3-ish or so. Even if they're a little bit inconsistent, and that gives you a much better understanding of depth. Allows for you to understand details that are happening within a surface. If everything is the same thick line weight all the way around all the details, it starts looking like a cartoon. I mean, it's Disney. So if you're going to be a Disney animator, that's cool. But as far as your kind of communication for your design intent, it's better to have a variety of line weights that allows you to punch out different details at different amounts. So be thinking about that as you're putting pen to the paper. You need these little dots. I love making these little dots. They're almost just kind of like it's information to your eye that you know, either light is reflecting or a radius. There's a little fillet or a radius there, and allows the brain to do what it does, which is interpret something, even if it's not fully on the page.
So I've really got 3 kind of lines right there. One that's the back of the plastic piece, and then a couple more. This fillet, I don't really, like, I feel like this is large enough on both the back and the front that I can hint at it with just, you know, my ballpoint pen. But I don't think that I necessarily need to try and worry about putting the dark, kind of high contrast area that you get from glass there. And in fact, what you'll see when you look at these images is that in some places that darkness kind of disappears. So this, I think, is just a good rule of thumb or a good way to approach it that gets you something that starts to look like glass. If you were trying to do photorealistic rendering, you might take a little bit more of a detailed approach to this. But from here, like, I kind of think, to me, it's like probably in the corners where there are some radiuses, I maybe fill it in with a little bit more black, and then try and let that trail off in certain locations. And maybe in some places I'll actually come back with the flare tip and just make the edge a little bit thicker. So right here, I think I'm just gonna fill in this entire, I like that detail. I wanna show off that detail, but then here I'm gonna trail out real quick. And here, same thing.
So how do you determine how much to fill in?
I don't. I guess. Yeah, that's the winging it side of things. The goal is really to hint at it, right? The goal is to say, all right, this is. I know that there's high contrast areas. On this, but I don't know exactly what would happen. I'm sure that there are CAD programs that can figure that out, right? But I don't know. That's a pretty complex algorithm that at least me right now am incapable of kind of processing. So again, I would just my thought here. This is a philosophy I actually kind of developed this morning. You're welcome. Is double lines to show the thickness, and then come in and fill some. Leave some white space. How about this? 40%.
40%.
And that gives me something that I feel is pretty good. And if I wanted to put some coffee in there, which I almost don't want to, I really like this drawing, and I feel like coffee may screw it up.
Spill the coffee.
What's that?
Don't spill the coffee.
Don't spill the coffee. Oh, I did like this detail. I didn't do it earlier. Kind of showing the refraction. Again, winging it, guessing. But I guess I'll add some coffee or some tea in here.
In your exploratory sketches, I would encourage you to even test out, this method, test out this. You can do a secondary line that's broken. The inner line can be broken instead of having two solid lines all the way up with a broken dart between it. You can have a solid line on the outside and a broken line on the inside. There's some different way of doing it. There's lots of different ways to kind of represent that glass, but what you're really trying to communicate is that there's refraction going on and there's light bouncing, and it interrupts the pure line that might be there otherwise.
All right, so there's what I think is a fairly level area. Now, one thing that I did last year, and I tried to do this year, but my marker bled a little too much on this first one, was I really wanted to hit one surface and then maybe the edges of the others, but I wanted to leave a white line where that liquid is it kind of, what is that term, a physics term? It pulls up on the sides a little bit. I feel like that sometimes that's going to show off a highlight, so I wanted to leave that white through there. I'll try a little bit harder on this one. That's it. That's capillary is what I was looking for. And so I'm going just below that line. And I'll start to roll it over. And this, I'm just going to fill in the surface. By the way, talk about winging it. I didn't even have brown markers at home. They're at work, or they're at school. They're at home. I don't know.
Yeah. This is our home.
Yeah.
That's a good way to think. For now, for the next couple of years.
So, the point of what I'm kind of doing now is I'm not really trying to draw coffee, right? So coffee is actually, oh, that is terrible, is a lot darker than what I'm drawing. This maybe looks a little bit more like tea. And I'm just trying to hint at where those surfaces are, where they start and where they stop. And then as this rolls around,
the kind of context that he was talking about earlier, having the tea or the coffee or some other item in the picture, chopsticks, like maybe if it's tea set or something, kind of gives that context that makes it look just a little bit more, gives a little bit more understanding, makes it look a little bit more maybe intriguing. And yeah.
Any tips on rendering if you want our coffee darker? Just don't make good coffee.
Get a better. Jared's using my old marker from when I was in school, so maybe it's a
Yeah.
marker would be.
Darker. I mean, you could fill in the whole thing. Yeah, and then also Rusty only had 2 brownish markers, so.
Sorry, Jared.
Rusty. So there's just coffee, and I was able to keep that line that shows maybe the surface. I could potentially kind of, you know what? I do want to walk this around because this is the detail that I like. And then there's that little dot again. This is the detail that I like, is that angle right there, and so I do want to highlight that, and that becomes part of it, right? What do I render and what do I not? Well, what are you trying to show off? And that's what I'm trying to show off. Okay, so let's see what else. I mean, the rest of this stuff is nothing new. Maybe the thing to show you would be what I feel like maybe the right level of marker, and that's almost a personal choice. It's just, again, we want you, the way the industry has moved and the way technology is helping us out these days. You'll probably spend less time marker rendering in your professional career than Rusty and I did. It's not to say it's not valuable. It can be extremely valuable. It's just...
One thing I've thought about adding to this class for years now that I haven't is to have you all draw on a whiteboard. You actually probably spend a decent amount of your time in your job drawing on a whiteboard in front of people. It's a little bit intimidating, and it's a totally different feel. Like it's hard to, it's right in front of your face and it's big, and you have to keep moving back and forth, and you can see the perspective's off and stuff. But it's a good thing to get used to it. So even if we don't do it in class, which I don't think we're going to, you got plenty of whiteboards all around the building. It's good to practice drawing on a whiteboard because if you're going to be a designer on a team of some sort, you're going to be drawing on a whiteboard in front of people. And it's a little bit awkward, and a little bit nervousness, when you're doing it, when you're talking to your boss or you're in a brainstorming session, you're trying to communicate an idea. Sometimes you're communicating other people's ideas that some engineers draw that looks terrible, and you have to communicate to the rest of the room so they can understand it. So it's a good little kind of side skill to get used to, is drawing on a whiteboard. I think in summer op, that's your it's not quite over there. We used to do all of the summer op demos on the whiteboard. Isn't that crazy?
I was actually, Rusty, I was just thinking, how did I teach this class the first year I did before I started putting the camera?
My first year here, we were still doing the summer op demos on the whiteboard, which is it's difficult.
Even technical?
Yeah, I don't know about technical, I guess so. I don't know how they did technical. I was only in the perspective section. You know that? If they did technical drawings on the whiteboard there?
I don't know.
And
I'm assuming that they had, there was certainly, I'm trying to remember when I took it. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Overhead projectors, maybe.
Oh, yeah, I guess they had those things.
This is one. Very fancy overhead projector. Clark uses.
Yeah, that Clark would be a good source. Clark still does a lot of things the way they did him when Marty McFly jumped on a DeLorean. I watched a DeLorean documentary this maybe a week ago. That guy was interesting.
So what's it on? What's the platform?
It was either I'm gonna guess it was Hulu.
It's one on Netflix as well.
Do you remember what it was called?
I don't remember what one on Netflix was called.
He was an interesting guy. We'll leave it at that.
I think they bought the warehouse, all the parts that they had stocked up.
Who did?
Some company, which they're making brand new old DeLoreans.
No way. In Belfast?
Something like that, yeah, they bought the warehouse, they had produced however many, and they had the parts just stacked in a warehouse, and some company bought it and was reproducing it, so.
Okay, I have a 70%. I thought I had a 40%. I do. I have a 40%, a 70%, and a 60%. I'm gonna try and get away with just the 40 and the 70. And so guess what? I'm winging it. So this surface and this surface should be about the same. So I'm gonna go with a 40% right here. And I may try and make some kind of differentiation as this rolls around, but ultimately, I'm not all that worried about it. I'm not all that worried about those streaks either, but I will come back over right here as this rolls around. I'm gonna leave that white, I'm gonna leave this white. I'm just gonna put kind of the slightest little hint that there's a dimple there. Let's see, this would be 40%. That's kind of how our eye would read that. Maybe I can add that. And then I'll add just a couple of lines as it rolls around that way. And then the 70, this might be from when I was in school. The 70 creates a pretty good amount of contrast, right? So the fewer markers that I use, I probably want to use some that are far enough from each other on the value scale that it really begins to read. And then I guess I did one thing on that which I liked, just kind of throw a little shadow. I'm just guessing where that shadow is. Throw a little shadow on there. Put a little more dark right there. And I mean, Rusty, what else might you add to this? I do want to add, I think it would be helpful. Let's do this. I think it would be helpful. I felt like this little background thing muddied this up to a point where I don't know if it was necessary. And so what I'm gonna do here is
I think you'd be able to read that better with a little bit.
Okay.
If it went darker.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't like.
Okay. I do want to put just because, and I might even go, this, I don't always do this, but I really want this to read right here. I really want this to read right there. Oh man. Oh man. And so you just notice how small this little background vignette is. And it had just one purpose, and that was to pop that negative specs out. And that's why I went so bold. Normally I wouldn't recommend doing that. And then I just didn't get the angle right. Oh, that makes me struggle. That makes me feel bad. I'm gonna take the warm 70 and show some, I'm gonna show some distortion. Of that. And then this was the 70. So I'm gonna go to 40. And I think this is what you were talking about, Rusty. Right here to show kind of the
Screen is definitely like bumps up the contrast a lot.
ouch, that looks bad. And if you just wait for a minute and let it dry, then you can go back over that and get it just a little bit darker. And then the last thing that at least I read, and have seen, is just maybe even in the corners you add just a little bit of gray where these things come together. And even running up, that might be a good place for this. And I can do that on the back too. Running up where those edges are. I'll probably get it right here. Actually, I want to make that darker. Jordan, 43%.
43.
So is this what our final rendering should look like?
It should be better than that.